I was asked to speak about impact assessment partly because I have been working recently in the international development field, and I think that, John felt that I could draw on that field in particular in contributing to this debate. In fact, I have, whilst clarifying what I want to say, decided to talk more about impact assessment and certainly much less about international development, to really do so in a fairly theoretical and conceptual way, to try and share with you some of the thinking that evaluators go through all the time when talking about impact assessment and engaging in the debates around it. Next slide, please. The argument I want to make is that things like outcomes, results, effects, and impacts are important, and we can't ignore them. But we need to think clearly about why this is so, what methods are appropriate, and in what circumstances different things are possible. Next, please. Evaluators have always been interested in these things, and the balance around summative and formative evaluation and debates about whether we ought to be looking at the end results or the processes, and there have been criticisms for a long time that evaluators tend to get bogged down in processes, as John was saying in his presentation, and too little thinking about outcomes. Next. There are often weaknesses in evaluation, partly because evaluations are skewed towards processes unconnected to outcomes. I think the word unconnected is deliberately chosen here. It is important to understand processes because otherwise try to understand why an outcome happened is very difficult. What is much more open to criticism are the kinds of studies where you have process evaluations and impact evaluations that are not linked together. Other kind of criticisms include the adoption of methods that don't try to disentangle what works from what is spurious, from what is due to a particular intervention initiative or to quite different causes. So people claiming credit for things that may in fact have nothing to do with their efforts, or not being given credit for things that are very much related to their efforts. Evaluators have been known to only be concerned with the direct beneficiaries and to do beneficiary surveys, but to ignore large populations of people who ought to be the beneficiaries but have never been included. And evaluators have often been criticized for privileging initial success, so that you look at things that have happened after a few months or a year, but never follow up in terms of what might be the more important longer-term results and effects of particular interventions. Very often people define impact assessment specifically in domains, and I work across different domains. So in the international development domain, I'm aware that the long-standing definition of impact assessment emphasizes duration. So the OECD DAC definition defines impact as long-term effects produced by a development intervention. Now, not all accept this. For example, the European Union has a very different description of what impact is. Next. There's been a great upsurge of interest in experimental scientific types of discourse in impact across many domains in recent years. This has been linked to medical trials. For example, the Cochrane collaboration was one of the main sources of thinking about experimental methods and spilling those over into other fields. And there have been similar moves in human services. The Campbell collaboration has been an active initiator of thinking around experimentation in recent years, reinforced very much by United States legislation requiring evaluations to be scientific. So you cannot separate out some of the growth in these movements from very strong domestic political pushes in the United States around health and education policy, which have spilled over into other more international arenas and most recently into international development. Impact in this context has been given a narrower methods-led meaning, and to paraphrase Moore, who is a pretty sensible methodologist in experimental methods, it's a comparison of what happens with what would have happened had the intervention not been implemented. And this perspective, which is advocated by people like Howard White at 3IE and the Global Development Center, impact has become identified with attribution and the counterfactual, and experimental methodologies and associated with that whole type of understanding within a particular school of science. This is not the first time that this model has been advocated. It recurs. I mean, I've been in the social science, applied social science and evaluation field for long enough to remember that we had the Nothing Works school in the early years of the Reagan administration. We had experimental methods very much around the Great Society types of initiatives. They come and go, they promise certainty, they tend to rise and then they tend to fall. But nonetheless, they do carry a certain core of truth and importance that we can't ignore and we shouldn't ignore. What I suppose I would be skeptical about is the notion that there is any one method that is superior to other methods, even though I would recognize that this is an important additional tool in our armory. But the battles that have gone on, for example, in the NONI group, which Nick York is very familiar with, and elsewhere, have tended to emphasize the importance of mixed methods and methods that are fit for different purposes and circumstances. But we would be wise to continue to distinguish between a narrow view of what impact assessment associated with experimental methods looks like and other ranges of methods that John has referred to in particular. I think it's important to just step back for a minute and to understand why this is important. Attribution does matter. We need to disentangle what makes a difference, what works, from changes that have nothing to do with our efforts. Not simply was the initiative successful, but also did this initiative intervention make a difference that would not have otherwise happened. Next. This is doodlings late at night in a hotel room, so you'll have to forgive the dotted lines and the rest, but let me take you through the figures. Figure 1 says, well, we have done an evaluation and we show that A leads to B. In many cases, we don't understand that A only leads to B because there's some interaction with something called C that is going on in the background, which is not immediately visible if you concentrate on the relationship in a logic model between A and B. In figure 2, yes, A leads to B, but in fact, A has got nothing at all to do with B. What is really causing B is a whole series of contextual and other factors that have got nothing to do with the efforts of the particular intervention. And indeed, if you look more widely, you'd find that there's another B going on somewhere else in the world that has nothing at all to do with the intervention that is being planned. So these kind of logical presentations are intended to indicate why issues of attribution matter, because in fact we are dealing with phenomena which are not immediately visible to the most obvious and simple kinds of evaluative or research designs. And figure 3 is even more puzzling because it says not only does, in the same configuration as figure 1, not only does A not lead to B, but C has no effect whatsoever. Because in fact, within many understandings of science, the kind of mediating factors only come into force under certain circumstances. They may be present, but they may not matter in some circumstances, but they may matter very seriously in other circumstances. So these are the kind of background thinking that inform a lot of the discussions about why attribution matters. Next, please. There are two complementary approaches to how social scientists and evaluators have approached this problem. There are comparative methods, which I use as a very broad label to encompass before and after comparisons, quasi-experiments, and full randomized experiments. All of them essentially depend on comparing something with something else in order to identify what it is that is distinctive in this thing that we're interested in. And the other approach is not looking at comparisons across cases, but is looking in-depth inside a case. So these are vaguely called, or variously called, theory-based methods, which include theories of change, causal modeling, realist analysis. The logic here being that by going in-depth into what are the links in the chain forensically between the different actions that are taken, it becomes more possible to understand what causes what. And there are various philosophical and methodological issues around that, which I'll come on to. But the